I came outside expecting a normal morning, and found my car smashed open with a crowbar by the HOA president. Fear, but from disbelief. A crowbar. On my car. In broad daylight. From the HOA president. I looked around the street, expecting someone, anyone, to come out. A neighbor. A witness. Someone who would say this wasn't normal. But the neighborhood stayed silent. Too silent. That silence hit harder than the damage. Because in that moment, I realized something disturbing. She didn't think she would face consequences. Margaret Blake turned her back and started walking away like nothing happened. Like she hadn't just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. My car wasn't just damaged. It was a message. And I was supposed to accept it. But as I stood there, staring at the broken glass and crushed metal, something shifted inside me. Not anger. Not panic. Something colder. More controlled. If she thought this would end quietly. She didn't understand what she had just started. Because I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to argue. I was going to do something she would never expect from someone like me. I pulled out my phone. And I started making calls. Not to the police first. Not to lawyers. But to the people she thought would stay silent forever. The neighbors. All of them. One by one. And by the time I was done, this wasn't going to be about one damaged car anymore. It was going to become something she could not control. By the time I hung up the last call, my hands had stopped shaking. Not because the situation was calm, but because something inside me had locked into place. Focus. I sat inside my damaged car for a moment, staring at the shattered glass still scattered across the seat. Every piece felt like a reminder of what just happened. Margaret Blake didn't just damage my property. She tested how far she could go. And no one stopped her. That was the real problem. So I started calling. One neighbor after another. At first, the reactions were exactly what I expected. Confusion. Disbelief. "Are you serious?" one of them asked. "I thought she couldn't do something like that," said another. But then something changed. As more people heard it, the tone shifted. Anger started to build. Not loud anger. Controlled anger. The kind that builds slowly, like pressure behind a wall. One of the neighbors, a retired man named Lewis, finally said something that changed everything. "She did something like that before," he said quietly. "Not to a car, but to someone's fence. And nothing happened." That line hit harder than the crowbar ever could. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was a pattern. And suddenly, my phone wasn't just making calls anymore, it was collecting stories. A fine that made no sense. A warning that felt personal. A rule that seemed designed just for one household. Margaret Blake wasn't enforcing HOA rules. She was using them. And the more people spoke, the clearer it became. Everyone had experienced something. They just never spoke about it together. Until now. By late afternoon, I made a final call. A formal HOA emergency meeting request. 51 neighbors. That number wasn't random. It was the entire voting body of the community. If they all showed up. She couldn't control the outcome. When I submitted the request, I didn't feel powerful. I felt calm. Because this was no longer about revenge. It was about exposure. That night, I received a message from the HOA system. Meeting approved. Community Hall. Tomorrow, 6 p.m. I stared at the screen for a long time. Somewhere in that building, Margaret Blake was about to walk into something she would never be able to predict. And for the first time since the crowbar hit my car, I wasn't the one reacting anymore. I was the one setting the stage. The next morning felt different. Not because anything had changed outside, but because something had changed between people. My phone didn't stop ringing. Messages. Calls. Voice notes. Neighbors I had never spoken to before were now talking like we had known each other for years. And every conversation had the same tone. Not anger anymore. Clarity. One woman sent me photos of old HOA notices, fees that made no sense, penalties with no explanation, warnings that felt targeted rather than fair. Another neighbor shared a story about Margaret Blake personally showing up at his door over a parking issue that wasn't even written in the rules. Piece by piece, the picture was forming. This wasn't strict enforcement. It was selective pressure. A system where fear replaced fairness. By noon, something unexpected happened. To stand in front of everyone and say what they had been too afraid to say alone. One by one, the silence that had protected Margaret Blake for years started breaking. And I realized something important. She didn't just control the rules. She controlled the fear of speaking against them. But fear only works in silence. And silence was gone. At 5:30 p.m., I arrived at the community hall early. The building was ordinary, brick walls, simple entrance, nothing special. But inside, it felt like something was about to shift permanently. Chairs were being arranged. People were arriving early, not sitting together by habit, but slowly gathering into groups. Whispers filled the room. Not gossip. Preparation. And then I saw her. Margaret Blake. She walked because this wasn't just about my car anymore. I stood up. Not fast. Not aggressive. Just steady. And the moment I did, the entire room shifted its attention. 51 neighbors. All watching. I spoke clearly. There is no property violation report filed against me. There is, however, a damaged vehicle, and witnesses who saw you do it. A murmur spread through the room. Margaret's expression tightened. That is an accusation without context, she replied quickly. The HOA has authority to enforce rules when residents ignore repeated warnings. But then something unexpected happened. A voice from the back of the room. Then another. And another. One by one, neighbors started standing up. Not shouting. Not fighting. Just speaking truth. A woman raised her hand and said, "She fined me for something that wasn't in the rulebook." Another man stood. "She came to my house without notice and threatened penalties I never agreed to." The room wasn't chaotic. It was worse. It was organized truth. And Margaret Blake was listening to all of it at once. Her authority didn't crack loudly. It started to erode quietly. Like sand slipping through fingers. She tried to interrupt. "Those issues are unrelated to this incident." But her voice was cut off. Not by me. By the collective room. For the first time, she couldn't control the narrative. I reached into my folder and placed something on the table. Printed emails. HOA notices. Photos. "I didn't call this meeting just about my car," I said. I paused. And looked directly at her. "I called it because this isn't the first time you've crossed a line. It's just the first time everyone is in the same room." Silence again. But this silence was different. Heavy. Final. Then the committee member beside her leaned forward slightly. "Margaret," he said quietly, "we need to address these concerns." That was it. The first crack inside her own structure. Her eyes shifted slightly. Not anger anymore. Calculation. Because she understood something very clearly now. She wasn't leading the room anymore. She was standing inside it. And it wasn't on her side. The room didn't feel like a meeting anymore. It felt like a verdict waiting to be delivered. Margaret Blake sat still for the first time since she walked in. No interruptions. No corrections. Just silence around her, and it was no longer in her control. She looked at the papers on the table in front of her, but didn't touch them. For someone who had controlled this community for years, that hesitation said everything. I stepped forward again. Not to attack, but to close the circle. "This isn't about revenge," I said calmly. "It's about accountability." I turned slightly so everyone could hear clearly. "No one here is against rules. We are against abuse of rules." A few people nodded. Then more. Then almost the entire room. Margaret finally spoke again, but her voice had changed. Lower. Less certain. "These accusations are emotional, not procedural." A man in the front row responded immediately. "They're not emotional. They're documented." He held up his phone. Then another neighbor stood up with printed emails. Then another with HOA fine records. The pattern was undeniable now. It wasn't one complaint. It was a system. And the system was exposed. Margaret's committee member leaned toward her and whispered something. She didn't respond. Instead, she slowly stood up. For the first time, she didn't look like the HOA president. She looked like someone realizing she had lost control of the room she built. "I have always acted in the best interest of this community," she said, trying to hold her ground. But her voice didn't carry the same weight anymore. Because the room no longer believed in the title. They believed in the truth they had just seen together. Then came the final moment. A formal motion was called from the HOA committee. A vote. To suspend her authority pending investigation. The room went quiet again. But this time, it wasn't anticipation. It was conclusion. One by one, hands were raised. Not dramatically. Not emotionally. Just decisively. And when the final count was done, 51 neighbors. Unanimous. Margaret Blake stood still. No argument left. No warning left. No authority left in the room. The committee member spoke quietly. "Margaret, your role is suspended effective immediately." No shouting followed. No celebration. Just a deep, collective release in the room. like something heavy had finally been lifted. I didn't say anything. There was nothing left to prove. As people slowly began standing up and leaving, neighbors who had never spoken to each other before exchanged small nods. Not victory. Closure. And as I walked out of the hall, I glanced back one last time. Margaret Blake was still sitting at the table. Alone. Surrounded by papers that no longer meant anything. And for the first time since the crowbar hit my car, the neighborhood was no longer silent.